Kia ora koutou, my name's Anthony White. I'm a landscape designer based in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and have been enjoying collaborating with Hong Yue on this beautiful landscape proposal. So I'm going to take you through the presentation. The concept of the bridge is really appropriate for a collaboration like this because we're looking at something that is both linking us from one side of the world to the other. And it's also a really beautiful concept at this time where we've all been isolated. But when we look at the idea of the way we can connect each other beyond borders and beyond sort of face-to-face experiences, which I think we've seen a lot of at the time. And so the concept of the bridge and the bridge as being central to the design, that is something that we look at and we reflect upon. And we reflect upon the things that connect us together despite separation or difference or all these other things that might pull people apart. The bridge is where we come together. So it seemed very meaningful at this particular time. So the design is very soft landscaping. The landscape is formed by plants and by the forming of the earth, rather than being dependent on structures. So it's really about the kind of the natural world and materiality and creating space from nature with nature. So whilst on the plan the hard structure is very minimal, there is a lot of form in the garden brought about by the contour of the landscape and by the colour composition within the garden which runs through. When visitors come to the garden, they will enter through this point. This path will be 2 meters wide to make a comfortable journey through the garden, just following this cursor around, out through the pavilion, through these garden hills and over this bridge and back out to exit through this point here. The experience of the garden is all about colour and different colour compositions. So the colour composition changes through the garden as you journey through it. Also, when you look at the exhibition from different places, the composition continually changes due to these complex colour combinations, which is a very European approach to the use of colour. Rather than block colour, we work in kind of deep spectrum of colour and kind of blended combinations of colour. So you come through this area, through to the pavilion. Now, at this end of the garden, the earth around here is raised high. So you could almost think of this area like a cave. So you come into this pavilion, which is a very simple architectural structure where 2 flat forms sit with very almost ethereal connections. There will, of course, be structural beams as well, but of beads and light that shimmers around it, creating little curtains and creating space within the architecture. But when you come into this pavilion from this cacophony of colour, this area in the back is very green, very serene, very much like you would find in a forest, a very reflective space with soft green moss through here, and the garden beds are mulched in charcoal. We use stone to help develop the contour of the garden and to help create that space. So to create this as a room behind the architecture with itself. So this is quite secret and quite intimate and quite a special experience in itself, and very contrasting to the rest of the garden, which is vibrant and uplifting. So when you are in this pavilion space, you look either to this area, which is very intimate and reflective and calm, or you look out to the bridge, out to the horizon. And this expresses duality, the duality of the inner self and the calm in our minds, but also our need to look out and to look to horizons and to see common connections between ourselves. The contours and the shapes of the garden through here are designed to create a vanishing point. And understanding there'll be a wildflower garden out this side, so we're looking to borrow the landscape through this point. So the bridge also acts in terms of composition as a frame that frames that vanishing point. So while this lawn here actually ends and encloses the garden when you're going through it, the perception when you're standing in the pavilion is that the vista continues down through this area. The idea too is that when you're on this bridge, you look back to the pavilion. So here we are looking out to the world, and here we are looking back to home. So back to the place of intimacy as we stand into there. So it shows the connectedness between both of these things as well. Now I'll take you through to the next page of the presentation. So this shows from the arrival point the composition. So you can see we've heightened the colours in terms of how we've presented it in this thing, but you can see that the form of the garden is really important in creating this sense of landscape within an urban setting. So really using contour, colour, playing with perspective, and this concept of this open space, the lawn in the centre of the garden disappearing under here, so a path leading into the distance that really heightens the sense of perspective in terms of composition. And the trees also do this in terms of framing that composition and creating that depth in terms of the garden experience for people. And the paths curving into the distance create this sense of discovery, so that whilst you see the whole garden, as you move through it, this composition continually changes. So the references to Monet through his work and through the use of colour relate to how we've approached colour in this garden. This is from Monet's own garden. And one of the other important things about the way colour is used in this way is our relationship with light and translucency of light, and how light falls through foliage and changes colour as well. And so when we go further into the architecture, we've taken this concept of light. And you can also, when you think back to this intimate space, which is green and dark and enclosed, and sort of where light is very kind of precious in moment, to the open space where the light is celebrated, is all part of this design's thinking. So here we are at the pavilion, which you can see is very minimalist. It's very simple form. There will be structural metal rods that hold the roof apart from the flooring below. But these curtains are strung from the top of the ceiling down, and they are made up of a series of ceramic and glass beads. So the idea is that at no point in the space are you shut out from the garden or hidden from it, but at the same time your experience as you move through it is corners are created, and that within these curtains light is captured and dances and reflects the garden. And we could even have like little touches of mirrors which the colours and the light will refract against and dance around. So there's a sense of life brought into the architecture, and a sense of space which is neither contained nor open. So when you move through it, you are entitled to these moments of intimacy where you look into this very serene closed space behind, as well as the sense of openness as you come through. So you are given a journey within the architecture, but with very small gestures in terms of the form of it. You can see here, this is the sort of materiality we're looking at in terms of these curtains which are fixed both the top of the roof and to the floor of the pavilion. So this is an example of a sort of ceramic bead, sort of glass balls, crystals. And the wonderful thing about crystals is the way that they refract life. We've used them in garden sculptures before, and even from a distance, you will see the entire thing shimmers and the light sparkles. It almost looks like there's LEDs dancing around, and yet it's not. It's just the sunlight itself refracting around it. So this is the idea, is that the effects that we're looking at in terms of light, in terms of the composition of the living elements of the garden, are also captured in the architecture. So this gives you a little bit of idea about the detailing of it, of this concept of this fixing to the bottom of the architecture here, these strings up and put together in sort of meshed out sheets which come through here. Now this isn't the structure which holds the roof apart, and that needs to be done with structural poles, which are placed within these curtains as they are. Nice, beautiful structure. As minimalist as possible, but it's totally what they are. We don't need to hide them. But at the same time, the actual form, the walls of the architecture are created by this very delicate material. And they create these sort of intimate corridors through where the views and what you see is changed. So your perception is constantly altered through your experience as you move through the garden and through the architecture. So the concept that things are never the same. They're constantly changing, and our perception can always be altered. So this gives you an idea of sort of the delicacy in terms of the form versus the structure of these two planes of roof, ground, delicate curtains. The structural poles have strength, but they're kind of incidental. And then this here too, this image to the right gives you an idea of that more green, intimate, the sort of shadowing that the architecture creates to create this beautiful forest scape, which is very endemic to Aotearoa, New Zealand, so very much home for me, but also, you know, in China, beautiful forests in China as well, where such places can be found. And then looking out to this other perspective of the garden. So within the architecture itself, the experience could be furnished with something as simple as cushions, and it's a very minimalist in terms of its materiality, because it's really about the space and the framing that we're creating than the architecture itself. So it should be very subdued and very minimalist in terms of the approach. And in terms of materiality and the experience when you're in there, we would encourage people, if it were appropriate, to be still and to take time to look and see. So once again, this takes you through an image of a Monet. You can see here the complex color scheme that's created by the planting, but also by the effect light has on color and that light has in a garden. So how light falls through the leaves of a tree onto a flower below versus something growing in the full sunlight. All of these different angles mean a garden is constantly changing through the day as well as through the seasons. So it's this beautiful, transformative composition. The path is also really important in the terms of the concept looking at escapism and journey. So the path leading us through the garden and through the composition as well, as we sit in the pavilion or view the garden from outside. The path creates the concept of us being able to go somewhere even when we sit in something. So sit within a composition. So a path in a painting still takes us somewhere. It still allows us to journey. So even when we are in a garden, in one space, the garden allows us to travel and to explore through seasons, through light, through color, and through our imaginations of being led through to somewhere beyond. The idea there is somewhere beyond. Colour through the garden is very, very important, and the use of colour composition is an important aspect of the design and the journey, both in terms of colour traditionally being the flowers, but also going into foliage, stems, buds, and the structure of the plant, all holding colour, which is used and carefully put together to compose. The contrast of colour is also really important. While we first look at this page and we see the burgundy and the colour, the lime greens are just as important in contrasting here. And that idea of light and dark is really important. You see this lime green and the shadow that these dark plummy colours create in a composition, which creates depth through the garden. And these lime greens that lift us up. So where colour is positioned is designed to increase depth and increase lift and darkness and contrast and the experience of the composition of the garden. So you can see here through these beautiful lime colours, we've still got these dark shadow plums, the dark in the foliage that come here that lift these highlights up out of the planting composition. You can see here too the contrast between the yellow and the burgundy. This picture is a very good example of how we use foliage to create depth and shadow in the garden. So rather than a constant blaze of colour, the colour is heightened by the shadow that we place behind it. So it creates you can see it here too in the dark shadows of this. Here, what we don't see heightens what we do see. Where the colour is placed in the garden also relates to composition. Red will pull your eye forward. So where we've put red is where we want to draw the composition forward. So the red garden is right next to the pavilion where we want you to be sort of kind of, it bangs and it jumps forward in your eye. Whereas when we've gone down, further down the garden, we've used blues, which will deepen the perspective. You can see too here that within these red colors, we're still using this dark shadow. We're still using these lime greens to create depth and contrast in our composition. This darkness through here, and look at the way the light comes through the foliage in this grasses here. Even in the dahlia, when we're looking at the color composition, we're looking at the dark shadows created by the petals as being as important to the composition as the color in the petal itself. And so what we're aiming to create when we talk about a yellow, for instance, color palette is this range of yellow. If you think about a rainbow color spectrum and how maybe on your computer you might receive the color yellow, and we look at it from the very orange tipped tones to the paler, almost, light kind of colors through here. We look at this phlomis with this kind of cottony yellow here. Into sort of things like sunflowers, which are very bright and poppy. And we look at a harakeke phormium here, where we have these like very white bleached variegations coming through, which particularly in shady areas of the garden can counter the shadow that we're talking about in other areas and really pop them up. So this through here, you can see here we've got the silver beet, which is a edible plant, but we look here, we're bringing in this yellow stem through here. And so this range of color creates this very gentle but very composed composition. And these colors come through in the trees as well. So the trees selected for the different areas of the garden relate to the color composition of that area of the garden. And here we go out into our vistas where we use blue running through other color palettes such as the yellow, and these color palettes, these soft blue tones, they make things feel longer, so they float us out. So when we look out to the bridge in the composition, these blues are extending our perspective and like a really relating to the sky and a sense of distance in terms of what we see. So we're using the color in this part of the composition to create a longer garden and to create depth with our perspective. We've picked up on the blues too, taking into the silvery tones. Trees such as olives potentially have those beautiful tones. A jacaranda too has these colors. And we look at things like globe artichokes, which have these beautiful silver sword-like leaves, but also beautiful electric purple flowers when they come into bloom. But we appreciate them not just for the flowers, even in their fruiting form or in their foliage form. They're a really essential part of the composition because we're creating gardens that endure beyond the moment. So when we put together with the flowers might be there for one moment in time, but we create gardens that even when the foliage is all that we see, they still have a beauty to them because we're transporting it across. Similarly here with the blueberries where we have these beautiful fruits, and it's really important to have food running through a garden and into garden composition because it reminds us of this connection that our gardens provide our sustenance. And that there is beauty in that. So we have these beautiful blueberries, but also blueberries have this beautiful glaucous silver foliage, which is also part of the composition. So when we select our plants, we are looking at foliage, we are looking at form, and we are looking at color. And we are looking really at a color spectrum. And here then we bring these collisions, so we bring our blends together. So we don't just have our reds, our blues, and our colours totally separated out. As we bring together more detail with the planting plan, we have our crossovers. So we start to mix the different more simple kind of spectral moments, and we then blend those together to start creating even more complex colour exploration. So we can then look at things like the purple and the orange, and we get these beautiful separating zings here, this contrast of these complementary colours that sit at other ends of the spectrum but do beautiful things together. So from the blues, we blend the blues with the oranges, then we go to the oranges, and then you can see that all throughout a composition, we have certain plants which are our memory plants. So we maintain things like the ligularia through here, our shadows and our highlights. So this is from Monet's garden as well, and we look and we can see the sun, the light coming through those colors. We can see the darkness in that composition, and we use foliage to enhance this sense. And then this is the palette for the garden, the cave garden, the serene garden that sits behind the pavilion. So these are really all about, this picture expresses it beautifully in terms of the light and the dark, the mossy greens, really this very naturalistic approach to planting in terms of the forest garden, a place which is very untouched, a place that is very serene. I guess the garden that is not gardened, the garden that is truly wild. So this is the bridge. It's a journey within a journey, not just a physical journey, but also a journey of the imagination, a reminder to connect with home, a story that tells us how a garden can take us many places beyond where we are into sort of distant things, and also a journey that tells us the importance of connections, the importance of bridges, and the importance of maintaining our relationships and our vision in terms of creativity and the world. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. I look forward to making this garden with Hong Yue. It's a wonderful thing to collaborate from one side of the world to the other at this time, and has been a really beautiful journey for me so far, and I look forward to seeing it emerge further. Thank you.